Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. My name is Travis Jamieson, and I'm your host. I'm also the pastor of Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church and the author of the new book, The Mystery of Faith: Why the Gospel is Still Good News, which you can pick up from any place you buy books. In this episode today, we welcome Dr. Susan Benton, New Testament scholar and lecturer in religion and ministry guidance at Baylor University. Her current research explores how inscriptions from the ancient Greco-Roman world can reshape our understanding of women's roles in early Christian groups. So join us as we explore the significance of these findings, the intersection of biblical scholarship and ministry, and why recovering these forgotten histories is crucial for the church today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you are and what you're doing in your day-to-day life right now?
Well, right now it's summer, so probably semester's done.
Like, relax. I'm doing podcasts right now.
And hanging out with my kids a little bit and catching up on sleep and appointments. So I'm Susan Benton, and I'm at Baylor University, where I am a lecturer, which is like our non-tenure track, teaching track role. So a lot of times it sounds like I'm like a temporary employee. This is why I clarify. But I work I teach a lot of our core courses, which here at Baylor are Christian scriptures and what we call Christian heritage, essentially like a one semester fast overview of the history of Christianity. And I also work in our ministry guidance program. And so for our students who are thinking about going into church ministry or something related, we have an undergraduate program for them to train in ministry skills, get a general sense of what does it mean to be a minister? What are the theological, biblical frameworks for that? What are some of the necessary skills? We're hoping a lot of them will end up, going on to seminary. But even if they don't, we want to give them at least a broad exposure to the skills that would involve. Ironically, or fittingly, perhaps, this is exactly what my major was when I was an undergrad and a religion major at a small school in Southern California. And I was a pastoral ministry major. And so now it's kind of full circle for me, getting to work with students who are thinking about doing that kind of work in the future.
Oh, that's so cool. So tell us a little bit about what led you to that degree as a college student. Like, because, I would say most high school students are not like, I'm going to go be a pastor now. Like, what was it? What inspired that?
Yeah. Okay. So I knew I'd be a religion major. So I grew up in a church, and my family was devout, and I was, often at church either for all of the church events that we had, or because that was where the piano was if I wanted to practice piano. Not that I ever got very good. But I was on one of those summer camps, or at a summer camp, but it was like a summer camp on wheels is what they would joke about it being. So I was literally riding a bicycle 50 miles a day, as one does, for this summer camp that we were raising money for missionaries and stuff. And I remember at 14 years old, having a conversation with God about, all the things I ever thought I was going to do with my life just don't seem to be panning out.
Mhm.
And
Life's already going off the rails at
I
14.
know, right? And I had a very short inventory, right, of like the little things I dreamed of. And sort of as a joke, I prayed, oh God, you're probably going to have me be like a missionary or a pastor's wife. Because to me, in my tradition at least, those seemed like the available options for a young woman wanting to serve God. And I felt like God was like, yeah. And I went, no, 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 just kidding. That was a joke. You can't hold me to that. But we were talking about, church kids and stubbornness and stuff. I sort of thought, okay, I've got him on a loophole here. Okay, God, if you really want me to do that, you're going to have to make me want that because I really don't want to do that. Um, and so I thought that would settle it because, stubborn, not going to change my opinion, I thought. And in about a year, I really wanted to go into church ministry.
Wow, that's fantastic. So after you were finished college, did you then go to seminary or did you start working at a church? What did that look like?
So I grew up in kind of a low church tradition where I didn't expect that I would need to go to seminary in order to go be in ministry. And one of my professors was really wise and wonderful and suggested that people get a couple years of ministry experience and then go on to seminary if they were thinking of that. And so, also having been a scholarship student and not really knowing anything about how to finance an education beyond that, I just sort of thought, I'll go get a job in ministry and see what I
Hmm.
can do. Um, and I ended up doing the thing that I thought I wouldn't do, which was become a youth pastor. And that was there's nothing wrong. It's actually really wonderful. And I really admire youth pastors who are very gifted at that. But I just always felt like an old soul when I was a teenager. So it didn't seem like the best fit to like go back and work with teenagers since didn't feel normal when I was one of them. But that ended up being my call for a little while. So I worked at a really small church on the coast in California in Half Moon Bay, not too far from where you are.
Oh,
And
yes.
then I ended up coming over and working at a bigger church in Menlo Park on a larger youth ministry staff.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you are really just close to us here in Palo Alto,
Yeah,
both Half
yeah,
Moon Bay and Menlo Park. That's
I
just our
know, I
next door
know.
neighbors.
Yeah.
What was it like making the transition from the pastoral church world
Mm.
to the academic world you are in now? I mean, what led to that change?
So that's an interesting question. So my Greek professor, I recently put up a picture of him. It's like in the background there. But at my graduation from my undergrad program, my Greek professor took me aside, took off his robes, and put them on me and said, I envision this for your future. I think you should think about
Wow.
going and getting a PhD, and you can come back and take my job. And I thought, what? I don't know what that even means. What does that involve? But I was, really honored. I loved him. I used to joke that he was like one of my faculty dads.
Hmm.
And so for it just kind of put a little thought into my mind. Um, and I think he had kind of talked about that once or twice, made suggestions, talked to me about how I was doing in Greek class and encouraged me to think about continuing studies. But like I mentioned, I mean, I was a scholarship student. My dad and I finished our BAs the same year. And so even though there was like some higher ed in my extended family, I just didn't really know. I was a first gen student and I didn't really know what it would involve. And so I just sort of put that aside and thought, I barely had any money to make it here. So just, we'll see. We'll see what will happen. And at every point along the way, I kind of learned enough information to get me to the next step. So when I came and worked for the church in Menlo, they had a seminary committee that helped to support people who might be thinking about ministry for the long term. And I met with them and they supported me to go and do a seminary degree while I was working. So I went back to school. Like nights and weekends while I was working with youth ministry students. And, some of my papers were practical and connected with the things we were doing, and some were about New Testament theology and other stuff.
Hmm.
But again, there was a particular professor who I only got to take at the very end of my coursework who, in a class, I think it was on Romans, or it was just I forget exactly, but definitely remember the section on Romans, where I mean, he talked so fast and I just loved it. Like everything, I felt like, oh, I'm like drinking from the fire hose and I'm learning so much and this is amazing. So many things. Like I've read the book of Romans a lot and, kind of had the impression that I knew all this stuff about it. And it turns out there's so much I don't know and I'm learning a lot. And I just thought, oh, I could keep doing this.
Mm.
And I would really love it if I got to. So again, I had that inspiration, a model, a person that I thought I would love to do what he does. And so, but I also was looking at kind of the gap of like good New Testament programs. So that's what I thought. I'll get a PhD in New Testament. But I lived on the West Coast. And like, there's like hardly a place out there where you could go and get a PhD in New Testament. It's like it's kind of a weird you know gap in the
Yeah.
educational system. So like, there are amazing places if you can get into them to go to school and do a PhD in religion, but I didn't know of anywhere I could go and do a PhD in New Testament. And so I thought I'll have to move my by then I was got married and had a son and thought I'll have to move my family now, leave all the family that I have here. It just seemed challenging to like figure out how that was going to fit in. But God kind of helped us out by moving us like 80% of the way across the country for the next stage in our ministry life. My husband took a job in Birmingham, Alabama, and we just felt called to work at this great kind of interracial church in the South and thought, wow, they're doing something that's going really well. We don't know what it is, but we're inspired and came over. And so then, I felt like, oh, okay, we're here. We're already away from family. Maybe the next thing, after we're here a while, we'll see how long God has us serve here. But maybe the next thing will be a PhD in New Testament. I could look into that.
Mhm.
So I think I had just sort of started to think about it. And I emailed my undergrad prof and I asked him, hey, if I wanted to put my toes back in, get myself ready, I've already thought about sitting in on some Greek and Hebrew classes nearby just to keep myself fresh in the languages. What else could I do? And so he suggested I start attending the Society of Biblical Literature at the annual meeting, the joint meeting with AAR, the American Academy of Religion. Sometimes we've got all these, acronyms that are annoying
Yes.
to throw out there. Sorry about that. And so I went to my first one. Meanwhile, we'd had kids. And so my youngest was 18 months old, and I went to my first conference. And while I was there, I reconnected with that one seminary professor that I felt really inspired by and sort of said, hey, I think I'm going to apply to some programs. Would you give me references, when I do that in a year or so, maybe? And he was like, yeah, that'd be great. And I talked with people at prospective programs, trying to lay the groundwork, see if they would know my name or face. And I got back home and my husband told me about some things that had been developing at the church. And I thought, oh, I think we're going to be out of here sooner than I thought.
Mm.
And so it turned into a problematic situation, unfortunately. And my husband was let go, but not basically an abusive situation from that pastor. And I say
Mm.
this knowing like this might get out there. I haven't really talked about this publicly, like in places where church members there, but
Mm.
unfortunately, like we tried to tell people what was happening, what he had experienced, and the kind of treatment he had been receiving. And the elders did not really listen and instead supported the pastor in firing him pretty summarily. It was kind of
Mm.
one of those situations where um, once the person starts to tell you that there are problems that you need to fix, there's like nothing you can do to redeem yourself. You're on the bad list. That was the way this guy treated him. And so
Yeah.
there was nothing he could do to rehabilitate. There was no improvement plan. It was just, you're failing and I'm disappointed in you. And it was basically the beginning of the end. So we
Yeah.
stuck it out for a few like awful months. But I started to plan for the next thing. And so I contacted my old professors, basically all three of those ones that I've mentioned as like really influential for me. And all of them were great about writing super last minute references for me. Um, and when things ended there, we transitioned and I started a program at Duke to get my THM to do a little bit more coursework in New Testament. And then my husband took a job working in North Carolina, at a wonderful church where that was really healing for us. And then after that, I applied to PhD programs. That's a very long story. Sorry,
I
it's
love
also
it.
detailed, but I'm
No,
good
that
at
was
reading
so,
out
I
the details.
appreciate your vulnerability and just your willingness to share that journey. Um, Ministry in churches is not always butterflies and rainbows. And so
Oh,
it can be really challenging at times. And so cool that you guys, you and your husband were working as a team throughout this. And like, it seems like you just have a way of flexing in your marriage to like, one of you has got to do something and the other's got to do another, and you just seem to make it work. And he's a pastor, and so
he
you
was
were
the
you were kind of you were a pastoral duo then. Yeah.
Yeah, so when we were working in youth ministry, he was doing kind of operations, administrative, and then moving into HR roles at our church. And I was doing more like pastoral side, but with a particular age group.
Hmm.
And then when we moved to Alabama, he took an administrative pastor role at like a non-denom church where if the church calls you pastor, you're a pastor. So
Hmm.
regardless of seminary degree or anything like that. But it was still like largely administrative for him. Um, and then when we moved to another church in North Carolina, he was the church administrator. So back into like Presbyterian church world where um, different kind of uh, recognition or names for the roles. So he was staff, not pastoral leadership.
Yes. Yeah.
But but uh that was a great environment where there wasn't, sometimes there can be like weird distinctions about like pastoral leadership and staff, as if it's like the lay
Mm.
people or the lowly ones who just do some grunt
Yes.
work. Well, that didn't feel like that there. And so it was wonderful. It was a great place for him to be a church administrator and help to just he's always loved making things possible for the people who do the more relational ministry
Hmm.
and keeping the focus on that and then making sure everybody is like well situated and equipped to do that. And then for
Yeah.
me, when I was, working in ministry, it was more the people and the department and the programs and all of that. So yeah, it has been a great it has been a great kind of balancing and trading off for us. So, and in North Carolina, it really was like a unique chance where both of us had a great opportunity. And then when it came time for my PhD, he just moved with me to Waco, like without a job, and
Mm.
was really, I mean, not for lack of trying, but just different size. Um, in Texas, the cities are really spread out. So there are like small cities around Waco, but the
Mhm.
next big cities are like an hour or 2 hours away. So just smaller pools. So it took him a while to find his place here, but that was something he was really willing to do in a way that
Mhm.
was a gift.
Yeah, you guys had that vision for what you were called to.
Yeah.
So, um, I know your PhD work has been in the study of women in the ancient Mediterranean world.
Yeah.
Um, so what a fascinating topic, because I think when you read the scriptures, you read about a lot of different women that show up in the story of the Bible, and
Mhm.
specifically in the New Testament. But I think sometimes, aside from maybe um, Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Elizabeth, a lot of the women don't get a lot of screen time, so to speak. And so you
Yeah,
see their names, like you might in Paul's letters, you get a bunch of their names at different times,
right.
and but you don't get a full picture. So I'm eager for, the rest of our time to really for you to talk a bit about your work and what you've learned over your years of study. So for where should we start for women in the ancient world? Where should we start?
Yeah.
Well, why don't we start with your work? As you started your PhD, what was the specific focus that you were going in on?
Oh, I was totally going to research poverty studies and Luke. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So this was not my plan. I'm lowering my chair so I can look a little. This was not my plan until I was in a seminar in my coursework, in my last full spring of coursework. And we were delving into associations and the New Testament. So this has become a kind of little subfield in social science research in the New Testament, where a bunch of scholars work on comparative work between these ancient, like when I'm explaining them to the average person, I'll say like they're like ancient clubs, like community associations.
Mm.
Some of them are guilds. Some of them are a little bit more like the Rotary or
Oh,
the
interesting.
Kiwanis or something.
Hmm.
And so they have like a particular role in their communities. They have like, stated identities and purposes. And they usually, you have to like join in officially and you kind of contribute financially to the club, the association, and its plans. And then every particular association has its own bylaws and plans for what they're going to do. And so it was in a course on this, and a lot of our evidence for these come from the inscriptions that are left by the associations. So for some of them, we have their membership rosters. And so we can see how many people were part of it. They'll have years and kind of the titles of the officials in the guild or the association. And sometimes we get descriptions of what they do. Sometimes we have some of their bylaws. So we have like a kind of smattering of evidence about what they did and what their identities were. And this comes from all over the Mediterranean world. We've got them from, present day Spain, we've got them from Italy, we've got them from Turkey and Palestine and Egypt and just everywhere. So there was this one inscription from an association in Ostia, so in like just outside of Rome or
Okay.
part of Rome. Uh, Sometimes I still get the Roman stuff funny. Uh, and it starts like the header of the inscription is large letters. It's held in the Vatican now, the big inscription, and it's beautiful, like this giant marble slab. And the top of it just says Salvia Marcellina. It's the title of the woman who then below it gives information about all that she did for her association. And
Hmm.
she's called the mother of the association. And I thought, that's really interesting. And we're reading this scholar, John Kloppenborg, who's done a ton of work about inscriptions, and he rightly emphasizes how much we learn from this inscription in a number of different places. But I just kept coming back to this woman is such a big deal. And I feel like for me, this is surprising or not what I would have expected because there's so many conventions when it comes to documentary evidence like this and inscriptional evidence. There are tons of men who are part of the association. Almost everybody else who's a part of, actually, everybody, I forget, everybody who's a part of the association, other than her, is a guy. But
Mm.
she's the one who has the, banner at the top, and she's the one who gives the major gift that's the endowment for the association. She decides where it will be meeting by donating the meeting place. She donates a statue that they'll use because it's this one is an association around the worship of Hygeia and Asclepius. And so she gives a statue that they'll use as part of their regular ritual worship. She decides their feasting schedule. She dictates how many members, what will be their cap. Like, here's how many seats we've got. And
Mm.
like, this is all written down on this giant inscription that holds then the bylaws of the association. And I just thought, why did we think women didn't do a lot of stuff? This seems to burst all of our assumptions. And I thought, I bet she's not the only one. This seems like this would be really useful to us to think with when we're talking about these women in the New Testament, where mostly what we get is a name. And like occasionally for a Phoebe, we hear um, that she's a presbyter, and we hear that she's a patron. So that, so I did a paper on that inscription, just making an initial suggestion. What if Salvia Marcellina became the person that we compared to Phoebe and to Prisca, two of the women that we know a lot
Mhm.
about? But I started with Phoebe mostly because Phoebe we know of as like being um, one of the people who is helping to lead in Cenchreae, and we know she's a patron of Paul. And it turned out when I read about Salvia Marcellina, there's a woman who works in Roman history research who had been talking already about how there are these two roles, patron and mother, in the associations that belong to women, especially in like the Latin speaking provinces. And so we have all these inscriptions, and she had done a bunch of research noting what's similar and different between the women who get called patron and the women who get called mother. And I was like, Phoebe gets called patron. So this
Yeah.
kind of seems like that is an important connection to make. But also, maybe we could talk about the fact that, Phoebe is called, oh my gosh, right now I'm blanking on our title. It's translated as servant sometimes, but it's not, right?
I
She's
don't
a,
have it on the top of
oh,
my
diaconus.
head.
Sorry, diaconus. She's called
Oh,
a
yes.
diaconus, right?
Yeah.
So she's a deacon.
Deacon.
Um,
Yeah.
sorry, she's not a presbyter. I totally misstated that. This is what I get for summer vacation brain.
Oh, that's totally fine. This happens all the time with me, so
All right. Well,
no judgment from me.
feel free to edit out that if it sounds too dumb or if it sounds approachable, you can leave it in there. Um, so so I thought, diaconus becomes a title among early Christians, and it's one that they use for the leadership eventually, and we see that in the New Testament scriptures. But I just thought, what if this mother role um, gives us some good thinking tools for all these women that we know who lead
Mhm.
in the early Christ groups? So I started to wonder, maybe we could talk about what they did because we don't really know much about what they did. We make assumptions based on information that starts to be clearer in like the late third and the fourth centuries. But this is the funny thing about early Christianity. For the first like 350 years, we have almost no specific evidence about what happened when they got together and met. So like we don't have um we don't have church bulletins, or like
Yeah.
program. Um
The minutes from the meeting. Yeah, they're
yeah,
missing. Yeah.
yeah. So when we imagine what they did when they meet together, we're filling in a lot of blanks. We're reading what Paul writes and what James writes and how First Peter talks about things. But like, we just have so many questions that we fill in from later church developments, but we may be figuring wrong. We may be filling
Mhm.
in, stuff that's later and not early. So that's one of the areas of growth and research, is trying to figure out what can we tell about those early years? Where did they meet before they built church buildings that were dedicated? Um, what 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 did a church meeting look like? When they're between the synagogue and having an established church. And we tend to call them like ecclesiae because that's just the literal word in the New Testament in Greek, or Christ groups, to help us to think outside of later church established expectations.
Mhm.
Um, and that really just got me started. Salvia Marcelina was like my big inspiration. I joke that like someday I'm going to name a dog Salvia, just to like, because I've been having kids. So, no children to name, but I'll name something after her in tribute. She won't be happy
Yes.
with the dog, sorry. Uh,
So in your work, and maybe you can talk a little bit about
mhm.
the field more generally, like when you are comparing like these associations to the church, it sounds like they do have some similarities in the sense, like you said, they were doing ritual worship of some kind in these different
Mhm.
associations. So it's not like they're just getting together to like provide fellowship for one another or like help in the community. They're actually worshiping something. So it is kind
Yeah.
of uh, it's church-like, so to speak. And
Mhm.
so is that a common way of trying to rebuild the world of the like the ancient world in a his for historians? Like, are you trying to see like what else was going on? And most likely, these Christians, these early Christians, would have been part of these groups at different times, and they would
Yeah.
have copied some of it.
Yes. Yes, that's definitely one of the ways in which we operate while trying to do the historical work of
Mhm.
supplying what we don't know. And and this has been going on, basically as long as we've had contemporary modern historical research on the scriptures. And so, starting in like the 1800s, when people started to interpret differently and do history differently and all of that, this way of asking the question, like, what if we have blank spaces in our scriptures and in what we know of this early period, then some of what we do is try to find what seems like a good comparable ancient structure or ancient entity that we might liken and see what we can learn. And
Mhm.
this has been done by New Testament scholars. A lot of this work really builds off of things that came from the 40s and 50s and up through scholars, all across the US and Europe for a long time, trying to figure out of other cultural groupings, gatherings of people, what's similar to early Christ groups and what's too different.
Mhm.
And so, of course, we've always been looking at how did temple worship among the Jewish people, and how did synagogue uh, gatherings and worship, how did those shape early Christianity? Because the earliest meetings are happening first in the synagogues as like this little, subset of the Jesus followers among the Jewish people, but then kind of bursting out of it too and incorporating a bunch of Gentiles and having this mishmash
Mhm.
of all the people. And so there was always that overlap, and a lot of people only wanted to look at that, but Judaism is also thoroughly Hellenized. It's very, it's part of the Greek and Roman empires for these hundreds of years. And so the things that are happening in the synagogues are not totally dissimilar from what's happening in other cultic groups. And when we say, like, when scholars say cultic, we're not talking like the Branch Davidians of Waco, you know. Um, we're not talking about like
Yeah.
death cults
Not
or, you
cults.
know,
No. Yeah.
yeah, but we're just talking about, like, we would say the worship in the temple in Jerusalem had a cult. So they had patterns of expected practices, and everybody knew what would happen when you go there to worship because that's the habits of the cult. And so that's very similar to other temples in the ancient world. Um, so we tend to look all across and
Hmm.
see like what's similar and what's different. So like, for example, when you compare the cult patterns of the Jewish people and the cult patterns in the surrounding Greco-Roman world, one of the things that is different is that the Jewish people don't have women priests for in many, at least in Jerusalem, as far as we know. They're not, and not according to their sacred texts. So the ones that do exist are in other locations, and they're not like, you know, we hear about like the line of Aaron, the Zadokite priests. We hear about like who gets to be authorized to be a priest. But priestesses in the Greco-Roman world, totally common. They're happening, they're everywhere. And you get the Vestal Virgins in Rome. You get the famous ones like the Oracle at Delphi, where she is speaking for the god. Um, so there's a lot of instances where women are empowered to speak. And this then, like, because I was starting to ask this question about, you know, the women in the early Christ groups, that the reality that Israel was so different in that respect as it developed, and then Judah was so different in its worship. Well, that's maybe part of the reason why eventually you get texts like Titus, where there are questions about whether women can preach or speak, or it seems like there's a kind of resistance to some of those Greco-Roman patterns.
So do you think, like for instance, the first believers in the early church
Yeah.
were coming out of the Jewish community? I
Hmm.
mean, they were Jewish,
Yeah.
and then they would have had the impression coming out of, synagogue, Jewish temple worship, that women were not, their place was not to be one of the priests or leaders, so to speak. Whereas the Gentiles, when they came into the picture, they wouldn't have had those same presuppositions. Is that what you're getting at a little bit?
At least in terms of like some of the official teachings. And
Hmm.
this is also what's kind of funny, and how my research intersected what with a movement that's sort of called people's history, where you're trying to get beyond like official documents and the statements that are prescriptive about what ought to be, but you're also recognizing that people don't do what the official stance is, right?
Hmm.
And that's why the official stance usually has to be reiterated, doubled down, consequences established, right? You don't have to do all that if everybody was already doing that without
Hmm.
needing to be restrained. And so there's a great scholar named Bernadette Bruton who's done a lot of great work pointing out like women, Jewish women who were called presbyters and who were priestesses. Actually, I have this one too. There's a scholar named Karen Jo Torgeson who's got a great book, When Women Were Priests.
Oh, cool.
And so that was already shifting even among the Jewish diaspora. But the place that tends to have the most restrictions is Jerusalem because of kind of the official controls on the temple cult there. And so that's, you know, that's the center of power. That's where you've got an establishment, and that's where the men are not sharing power very
Hmm.
willingly. But you have gatherings of Jewish women, or Jewish people where women are leading in other places, and it doesn't seem to be such a big deal. And in the synagogues, there's there's just a lot more variety depending on where you are. So
Yeah, yeah.
so the world is changing, all the time. I think that this is one of the things that the more I, spend time in ancient history, the more I see, nothing is ever simple. It isn't simple now. You can't generalize about how do Americans feel about women and men,
Mhm.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's like a whole kettle of fish of its own. And
Yeah.
the ancients are the same. I mean, the reason you have ancient moralistic writers trying to tell young women how to be the ideal wife is that they want to tell women what to do because
Mhm.
women don't do that um, on their own. And even they have like a broader picture of what those women are doing as educators of their children, as industrious people who have to help to sustain their households and to a certain extent always in history, right? The people who write and commemorate their patterns of life are like the wealthy aristocrats who have a
Mhm.
lot of opinions about how everybody ought to live, but like you have to be a wealthy aristocrat to live this way. So if you don't have a housekeeper and you can't hire a tutor and um, you don't have the luxury of farming out all of the labor of everything, then you do it all because that's
Mhm.
just what people have always been doing.
Yeah, the work has to get done regardless.
Yeah.
And your point, though, about like you can't generalize about the ancient world just like you can't today. That's what really struck me as I was reading your chapter on women in the ancient Mediterranean world in the book Behind the Scenes of the New Testament. Um, right away, I thought I just wrote in the margin, sounds like today. And it was like, and you
Yeah.
you wrote, in the early Roman Empire, women's identities and roles were often dynamic, neither conforming entirely to social prescription nor ever completely free of them. And I thought, wow, yeah, I mean, that is a very, what struck me about it was a very kind of human way of looking at life. Like, we can look back at any time period and make assumptions about the whole group. But when we think, well, they were still human beings, and if we look at our community today, we know that human beings act in all kinds of different ways. And there's never really a group that acts in the exact same way all the time. And
Yeah.
so I found that really helpful for like just like helping us reimagine, okay, the time of the Bible was not like all these cookie cutter people.
Yeah.
But there was a lot going on, which is why there's always been, you know, confusion, especially I think from the Apostle Paul about like what did he
What are you
think
doing?
about women? It seems like he
Yeah.
says a variety, he's saying, things that contradict, where it's like yeah, you call it the gag order in, his epistles to the Timothy. But then there's also like him like having mentioning Phoebe as the deacon and then also
Yeah.
learning from Priscilla and Aquila. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about um what were some of the reasons that there was some of that there is some of that um, you know, multiple messages coming from Paul, it feels like at times with women.
Oh gosh. Um, yeah. Well, let's see. We could go so many directions, like the
Well,
psyche of
may
Paul, the literature of Paul. But no, I
yeah,
know what you mean.
maybe let's start with, I
Yeah.
think the famous story of Priscilla and Aquila, like him
Yeah.
being taught by this couple, it seems like. Can you share a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Well, so okay. So yeah, I think one of the things, so I end up spending a bunch of time. So I actually have my book is coming out soon, about like my in-depth research on um, Salvia Marcellina and the associations and stuff. But it's gonna be like a nerdy scholar book. So, I don't blame anyone for not wanting to write it, but patrons and mothers in associations and the New Testament, this is what it's going to be. And you could ask for it at like your local library or something,
Yeah.
because it's going to be like a library book for research. And then I'm hoping to write one that would be a little bit more reader friendly for everybody. Because so in the New Testament, we just have a more complicated picture than many would like us to believe.
Mhm.
And I don't mean that like to be hard on anyone, because I think people are they're trying to do their best, right, to make sense of things. But sometimes in our effort to like recognize the authority of the scriptures and their value for us, we kind of flatten them to establish our ideal that they would agree in every place, right? Here's the example I give to my students. In the letter of First Corinthians, Paul says in one place, women who prophesy need to cover their heads. Okay, how does prophecy happen in a worship context? Is this a silent event? No.
No.
Prophecy is a person speaking in the worship context and proclaiming the divine word from God in that moment. It's a pretty authoritative act. And elsewhere in Paul's writings, he says God gave us first apostles, then prophets, then teachers. Maybe he's being hierarchical or maybe he's not. But in any case, prophets are important in like the leadership roster.
Mhm.
So he's assuming that women do speak in the worship service and just describing what they ought to wear as a sign of respect. By the way, he also says the men ought to be a certain way too when they pray. So, you got to like, if you want women to wear head coverings because you think this is a perennial instruction for all time, you ought to have a hair like length or something that you need to stipulate for your men, just to be fair. So most places don't bother with that because we do recognize that cultural instruction, right, about a head covering or a hair length. But same letter, couple chapters later. So that's First Corinthians chapter 11. But couple chapters later in 14, he says, I don't allow a woman to speak or to, uh, women be silent in the churches. Women must be silent. These two are not internally consistent. You cannot both prophesy, but just with your head covered, and be silent during the whole worship service. You have to pick one or the other that you think he's saying. So some people think that the silence thing is a Corinthian slogan that he's repeating back to them and then refuting based on his explanations of how the new body of believers is meant to function. But no matter what, you have a dilemma because these are not complementary instructions. Well, so this is what you get with Paul. And one thing that makes this so hard is like ancient Greek doesn't use quotation marks. So if it was a Corinthian slogan, there's not a way, or like he didn't use a clear way where he could indicate this is what someone says. So it's contextual. That's how you would know. So you have this internal dilemma, and then you also have then that by the time you get to the later books, which most New Testament scholars now call the pseudo-Paulines, so Timothy and Titus, when you look at the ways they talk, they seem to see a more kind of established church community with expectations for elders and for deacons and their offices. But like in Corinth, wouldn't things have been so easy if he could have just said, like, listen to your elder? But he doesn't seem to have a title or, an office that he can appeal to for the authority there. So we are looking at a later stage. So maybe some people really want to say that's Paul and just later in his life when he writes to Timothy and Titus. Either way, It's a
Mhm.
later stage where then there are some expectations for leadership roles. And there is then this like a woman should learn in silence and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach. Okay. Even if you think that's Paul, Paul is really supportive of Prisca, who is a teacher with her husband, Aquila. And we hear about this both in the book of Acts, written by another author, talking about the development of the ministry of Paul and all of the people he works with. But we also hear about Prisca in that letter to the Corinthians, and we hear about Prisca in Ephesians. And there's never a critical word about her. And in fact, she is honored and esteemed, and her name comes before Aquila, which at least means she's important and usually means she's more important than him. And
Mhm.
that's reversing expectations. This is like the etiquette for, an invitation to a wedding. Um, you don't write Mr., you don't write Mrs. and Mr., you write Mr. and Mrs., right? That's the convention. And the convention would be to say Aquila and Prisca, but he doesn't. Only in one place does Aquila's name come first. Every other place they appear, it's Prisca and Aquila.
Mm.
So somehow she's the more prominent of the two of them. How could he possibly endorse, support, approve of, and kind of promote her as a person who is teaching people and also say, I do not permit a woman to teach?
Mhm.
So you have these things that they just don't go together well. And differing interpreters, different church traditions will lean on one or the other,
Mhm.
um, and then explain from that vantage point how to put the other in perspective. But there really isn't, I can't see any good way to explain the role that Prisca plays that allows for wholehearted consistency with this. I do not permit a woman to teach,
Mhm.
because she teaches and Paul supports and promotes her. And um, I just don't think there's a good way to get around that. You can't just say either. The argument that people will often put out is there was no available man. Aquila was right there. He's like, I mean, the names are paired together.
Yeah.
So if that was the issue, Aquila could have done it. He was there. So what I wanted to do with my research was really try to strengthen our understanding of the real women who do get endorsed in the scriptures and that we know were influential, important in the early communities and helping to shape their lives together. And I wanted to try to figure out, okay, we have a few places where their names get called, places where they get praised. The biggest kind of roster is in Romans 16, where we
Mhm.
see all the different women who are co-workers with Paul, Junia, who's among the apostles, and like there's like a long history about how that gets changed eventually to make her into Junius because early church fathers, and by early, it's like 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, just look at that and say, that couldn't be a woman.
Yeah. Right.
But that's what we keep doing throughout history. Instead of changing our understanding of what happened based on the evidence we have, we fix the evidence to match our assumption. And I
Mhm.
want us to try to stop doing that and instead just try to see like what what happened and then how do we match our understanding to the evidence that we have. So we have lots of women that we hear about. We know Phoebe, we know Prisca, we know Mary and Tryphena and Tryphosa and Euodia and Syntyche, who are sometimes a problem, but that only matters if they're important.
Yeah.
And so, um, so I really just wanted to say, can we stop talking on the theoretical level about what might or might not be a universal prohibition, and instead try to talk about, we know there were women. What did they do?
Yeah. I love that. I think that's a really helpful way to read scripture by not flattening it. I think it is really uncomfortable, I think, for many Christians to think that, excuse me, that scripture isn't always perfectly aligned with itself,
Yeah.
at least from our perspective, like as we read it, right, as human beings.
Yeah.
And and I think that that's really helpful to just let that be, because if you don't let that be, then you're going to feel like this pressure or feel forced to to make it work according to whatever viewpoint you have. But when you can be like, you know what, if we're honest about it, there are some things that Paul says in one place, and then we think he says in other places that seemingly contradict itself. And we don't necessarily always have to solve that contradiction, because when we do, it sounds like we start to say things that really aren't being said. And that's really helpful. I think that could be applied in a variety of topics, but this one in particular. Um, so we're kind of running up on our time here.
I know.
This is it's such a huge topic, and I hope our listeners that this would just pique their interest in thinking a little bit more deeply um, about what was going on in the time of the stories of the Bible. I think, especially the way you talk about women help me to see that like these there wasn't just one kind of woman in the ancient world, and they played different roles. And so the last question I wanted to ask about um, the women that Paul mentions is whether you think were these women wealthy individuals? Like when you say
Mm,
they're patrons, like is that one of the reasons they have status? Because it seems like when I was reading your work, that women in other communities, other religious communities, the ones with power tended to also have wealth and means. And so was that like a
yeah.
big factor going on here?
That's a great question. I think as we can see in the present, oftentimes wealth affords privileges and liberties to defy expectations, to become definers of social roles. Um, and so a lot of times, the women that we end up seeing who do have more freedoms seem to be women of means,
Hmm.
because, uh, I mean, it's sort of it's connected with often this idea of like you are a favored being, right? Favored by the gods, divinely
Oh,
favored
yeah.
somehow. And so again, there's like a sort of self-evident virtue to the wealthy in a society that tends to believe in the law of sowing and reaping, right?
Hmm.
And like even with acknowledgments that this there are exceptions and sometimes evil people prosper, if your general rule is, well, people who prosper did so because the gods favored them and they're virtuous, then you end up looking to them as models. And so this happened among the ancients, I think, a lot. So then there is a sense in which what the wealthy and privileged do is right because it's done by those who are favored by the gods. And they don't suffer after doing it, right? There's no correction to mark that they have transgressed. And so, therefore, it is right. It continues to be shown to be right. So, therefore, they become a kind of exemplar.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that still helps other ancient women because it gives you other models. It gives you exemplars that show that you can be a good and virtuous woman who is actively engaged in the political machinations of your community and the decision-making process. You can be someone who, I mean, in the essay that you read, I talk about how there are women who are administering the sporting events of the communities, and there are women who are funding the games, and there are women who are competitors in the games, even. I don't think I even mentioned that, but There are people who are funding the feasts and annual events. There are people who are kind of the mayor for a year, or like the civic office that runs the community. So that, I think, obviously it benefits or empowers first those who are privileged, but it helps then the rest of the women in the society around them to be seen as capable, to have a little bit more latitude. Um, so I think for me, what that makes me assume then is they're broadening the spectrum of acceptable options, right? So that it doesn't seem to be strange for women to do such things, because the more women you know who do them, the less of a deal it is.
Right, right. Yeah, that's great. And that just immediately makes me think of the kind of upside down nature of the gospel, that Jesus was born to a young girl who
Mhm.
had no social standing or wealth or status, in that sense of like she wasn't of the elite.
Yeah.
And yet that is exactly how God chose to enter the world.
Yes.
And, just kind of, it's like God has used throughout history, he's used the wealthy and the
Yeah.
elite in societies to do really good things. And he's never limited by that. And it's just,
Yeah. And
part of the
he
good news.
And he's always raising up people to question, abuses of power
Hmm.
or entrenchment of privilege that doesn't really benefit. I mean, if you read all the prophets, they're big on criticizing structures of injustice, and many of them are just humble people who receive a call. And
Hmm.
so I do think that's something that is, that's one of the things that I think is fascinating about the roles of the women in Christ groups, is that as much as there's always the opportunity for women who are patrons to kind of make a place for themselves by a big donation, and maybe that's partly what Phoebe does. Paul says she is a patron to me and to many others. And so that sounds to me like she's a person who's been, and as far as we know, she's not a Jewish Christian. So she's like a Gentile Christian who's been converted. I picture her as like one of the nouveau riche, she's like coming from the not an old established aristocracy around Corinth and Cenchreae, but like some new wealth that has been created with the redevelopment of the city and the port. And she became a Christian and saw really quickly, hey, I can contribute. I've got some resources. I can help to fund this guy, Paul, who, writes a lot. That's expensive. He needs his amanuensis paid for, and he needs a lot of paper and ink. And um, he's sending out these letters, and they're really important. I want to support that work. But
Yeah, she was
also,
she was probably like, he can't just do Amazon Prime all the time.
I know,
He needs
right?
some
Like
help.
Amazon books, Kindle downloads, like it's not a 99-cent deal. Like he's got to have some money here.
Yeah, exactly.
And
That's so good.
so she uses that to like help her, I mean, to help herself, like in the community, but also just to serve the community. These
Mhm.
things are reciprocal in a way that sometimes it's uncomfortable to think about, because you think of like buying influence. But I think that's where we have to hope and trust that like Paul is a savvier guy than that, and he's not just letting this like greedy woman exploit him for her own status, but he's actually like seeing her grow in Christ-likeness and devotion to God. And so he's careful about who he allows to influence him and then who he raises up and praises. But we also, the rest of these women, we don't know anything about their backgrounds. They're not
Yeah.
prominent. They're not important. And it's like Paul says to the Corinthians, not many of you were from significant backgrounds. You weren't, you weren't the admirable, well-known people of the world, but God loved you and God called you, and now you
Yeah.
belong to him. And so there's kind of more opportunity for women and for formerly enslaved people and for currently enslaved people in the Christ groups than there is elsewhere. So, ironically, sometimes I feel like we're like flipping that and going backward when we try to say like, oh, we need a rigid hierarchy, when like the early Christians were seen sometimes as like suspect because they didn't go in so clearly for all the hierarchies, or they at least said and did some things that undermine that so that people thought maybe they're not good Romans. Maybe they're going to undo the social order. You know, it'd be like now, like, oh, they're the Marxists or they're the communists. They're not
Yeah.
gonna.
Everyone always needs a bad guy.
Yeah,
Christians
I
got
don't
their
think those
fair
are
share.
legitimate critiques of
Yeah.
people often in our present time. But like we have the categories, right? Of like
Yeah.
people were worried about, and they were sometimes among them, so that they had to like overcompensate and try to prove to overseeing powers that like, no, we're like good, virtuous people who are willing to pray for, the emperor. So don't
Yeah.
worry, we're not going to overthrow everything.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for coming on today. This
Yeah.
has been a great conversation, and I kind of hope we'll have you back at some point because I think you're just a wealth of knowledge. I mean, there's just so much we could have talked about. So we just got the tip of the
Thank you.
iceberg today. So um, I will put your book in the notes, and it's your new book is not out yet, but we will.
No, I just sent them like my indices and pages and stuff.
Okay.
So it's like any minute, I don't know. I don't know when they're gonna when it will finally be done, but I haven't heard back yet from my publisher saying any more changes I need to make. So I
Yes.
think
Hey,
I
that's a
think
good
maybe
sign.
it's done.
It's just going to show up on your doorstep like tomorrow.
I know, right? I'll get 10 copies and I'll be like, oh, it's out, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, like and subscribe and pass it on to a friend. We want more people to know about these great conversations.